The following news flash is brought to you by the Lone Star Lowdown, providing your daily bulletins for the commodities market. Today in history, news updates, and the inside scoop into the tides of the alternative. Markets for Friday, the 18th of March, 2016 are currently trading with gold at $1,255.09 an ounce, silver $15.79 an ounce, Texas crude $40.20 a barrel, and Bitcoin is currently sitting at about 409 U.S. currency. Today in history, the year 1314, Jacques de Molay, the 23rd and last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, is burned at the stake at a scaffold in front of Notre Dame by decree of the cardinals in conjunction with the Archbishop of Sens and some other prelates who were called in. Templar Grand Masters de Molay and Charnay were slowly burned to death for refusing to recant their heretical beliefs. Today in history. In recent news, Salah Abdeslam, Europe's most wanted man for being suspected of physically partaking in the Paris Islamic State shootings November of last year, was captured today after a shootout in Brussels. This capture finally giving investigators the first suspected active participant to be taken alive. Prosecutors said a second wanted man, who used the false name of Amin Chakouri, was also wounded and captured in the raid. Luckily, French President François Hollande was visiting Brussels for a European summit and was able to personally conduct a joint news conference with the Belgian Prime Minister Charles Michel, where he said that France would request very soon the extradition of Salah Abdeslam. Security services will obviously be seeking information on Islamic State plans and structures, his contacts in Europe and in Syria, and looking into his support and financial networks. Police did obtain Abdesam's fingerprints as well as fake Syrian and Belgian identity documents. Radar scans of King Tut's burial chamber have revealed two hidden compartments. Yesterday, at a Cairo news conference, Egyptian Antiquities Minister Mamdouh Al-Damadi declined to comment on whether any royal treasure or more mummies might be inside of the rooms, but did state that the unexplored chambers could hold some kind of organic or metal objects. He also showed the results of the radar scans that revealed anomalies in the walls of the tomb, indicating a possible hidden door and rooms behind false walls that were covered up and painted over with hieroglyphics. The radar scans of the chamber taken last year and analyzed in Japan are set to be repeated at the end of the month for verification. The Lone Star Lowdown is currently looking to fill some ad slots. If you have a product or a service that you'd like to advertise with us, feel free to give me a call at 210-363-2257. This has been Rick Rohde with your Lowdown for March 18th, 2016.
You're tuned to Truth News Radio on the 5th of March 2016. Great to have you aboard. My name's Hereward Fenton and I will be your host for the next hour. On today's show, I'm going to be looking into the left-right paradigm, what I might call the left-right trap, because I do believe that in recent times the political spectrum has been so polarised and so controlled by the left-right paradigm that those who accept these designations find that they are unwittingly drawn in to a kind of a polarised situation where they're not actually able to have independent viewpoints because of the pressure of this tendency to group beliefs and attitudes into either the left or the right pigeonholes. And it is a really big problem for freedom. And one has to admire the genius of the power elites who presumably control our dialogue and our political spectrum, that they are able to so easily control people's behaviour by simply lumping people in either as left or right. I want to understand a little bit about the history of this concept. And I'm going to play you a few video clips. I'm going to play to you some clips from famous economist Friedrich von Hayek, something from Noam Chomsky, and also a clip from G. Edward Griffin. And let me emphasise that I do not adhere to any of these people. You'll notice some of the people I quoted there belong to different sides of the political divide, and that's, from my opinion, I don't have a problem with that at all. And in my own views, as I've stridently expressed them on this show, I often cross the line between left and right. I don't accept the grouping mechanism. I don't accept the designation, and I do find it to be a type of a trap. And it's one that people often fall into without realising it. And, the nature of human nature being what it is, people do feel comfortable belonging to some type of group. So once you've fallen in to the group designation, a lot of people go along with it because they think, well, I've got all these people who I roughly agree with, so I'll call myself right-wing. See, that's a mistake, and that's where you really need to step back and you need to take a broader view, a deeper view, a more historical view, and that's partly what I'm going to be doing today. Now, let's just briefly survey some of the topics that become controversial, that are sort of hot-button topics between left and right. Issues such as taxation, wealth redistribution, social security, universal health care, marriage equality, abortion, traditional morality versus sort of progressive morality, warfare and foreign interventions, economic freedom, and statute law. And there's a lot of detail in all of those topics that I won't have time to go into today. But each of those topics that I've just raised with you have kind of a left-wing and a right-wing slant. Of course, left-wing people are supposedly pro-taxation. They are pro-social security. They are pro-universal health care. They are pro-wealth redistribution. They are pro-choice in matters of marriage equality, in matters of abortion, whereas right-wing people are against taxation, or for they argue for less taxation. They are against social security or argue for less. They are against universal health care. They are against wealth redistribution. And these are very commonly seen in discourse, and many people who belong to either the left or the right proudly advocate these viewpoints. But, what do we see less of? And it's actually very hard to find it on the internet, is a critique of the entire paradigm, is writers and researchers who are prepared to really investigate the distinctive features of left versus right, and to unflinchingly look at what we see in the modern world, what we see happening right now. And when people do that, when you're willing to do that, when you're willing to open your eyes, what you'll see is that both the advocates of the so-called left and so-called right in all modern Western societies have an awful lot in common, folks. They have more in common than they have which divides them. Of course, the hot-button topics like abortion and marriage equality are polarised topics. But, they are actually minor issues. They are issues that are very, very important to powerful vocal minorities in our society. But they're still not the issues which preoccupy the vast, vast bulk of people. But when we come down to issues of taxation, social security, healthcare, the economic freedom, what we find is that they're almost identical. They don't vary much. But if we actually go into the history of the study of political philosophy and economic philosophy, what we do find is that in the classical critiques, for example, the critique of Hayek on modern socialism, Hayek pointed out that the central problem with socialism was the emphasis on central planning, which is also connected to an emphasis of collectivist political solutions. And this vision of the world as being best controlled by a collectivist, centrally organised governing system, unfortunately, has actually crept into both sides of politics. And we see it equally on the right and equally on the left. Now, some people, such as Noam Chomsky, view this as, well, the whole world has shifted to the right. But that's because Noam Chomsky, being so firmly aligned with a label, and I just called it a label, a sort of a meaningless label of being a left-wing thinker, insists that everything that we're seeing now that is bad is actually a shift to the right. But then many other thinkers, people, for example, Ron Paul or some of the Tea Party people, see that the phenomena that we're seeing, particularly in the United States, but applies to Australia as well, is kind of a shift towards socialism. So depending on your vested interests, you'll either see what's happening at the moment as a giant lurch towards the right or a giant lurch towards the left. And in a way, these are just labels, and the labels are losing their meaning. interesting historical note is that left and right actually derive from the French Revolution. And I do have just a brief quote here that I'm going to give you from Wikipedia. The terms left and right appeared during the French Revolution of 1789, when members of the National Assembly divided into supporters of the king to the president's right and supporters of the revolution to his left. One deputy, the Baron de Gauville, explained, "We began to recognise each other. Those who were loyal to religion and the king took up positions to the right of the chair so as to avoid the shouts, oaths and indecencies that enjoyed free rein in the opposing camp. However, the right opposed the sitting arrangement because they believed that deputies should support private or general interests but should not form factions or political parties." So that's just an interesting little anecdote there from history. But of course, the flavour of left versus right being progressive versus traditional stays with us, even though so much of the body, the actual content of what so-called left versus right politicians advocate has tended to merge. Now, on that note, I want to actually read to you an article titled "Freedom is Neither Left Nor Right," and this is from thedailybell.com, and I thought this was a reasonable summary of what I actually believe and what I think is correct. The author of this article is Richard Ebeling, and it was authored in 2014. We live in a time when virtually all political parties and candidates stand for the same fundamental ideological idea: state interventionism and compulsory redistribution. This also applies to the mainstream media. Even many who say they adhere to a pro-market view of things, in fact, turn out to be only more moderate advocates of government regulations and welfare state programs. This is why political labels have become increasingly meaningless. Back in the 1950s and 1960s, it was a common practice in political discussions to refer to people on the left as socialists or communists and to call those on the right fascists or Nazis. American liberals were considered left-wingers who were for bigger government and sympathetic to socialism, while conservatives were viewed as right-wingers who were pro-big business and against the little guy and therefore closet fascists. These distinctions were misplaced and irrelevant because in the reality of 20th century history, both left-wingers and right-wingers were merely two variations on the same collectivist theme. Both were devoted to government control of social and economic life, with only minor institutional differences between them. Marxian socialists advocated government nationalisation and direct central planning of all production, while Italian fascists and German Nazis were for comprehensive government regulation and planning of all property that remained nominally in private hands. In addition, Marxists spoke of an international workers' revolution in comparison to fascists and Nazis who talked about nationalist and racial wars. Both socialists and fascists therefore believed that the world was divided into collective groups, social classes or races, that were inherently and inescapably in conflict with each other. The individual was denied meaning and existence outside of the tribe or social herd. In our own times, Mussolini and Hitler-type fascism is long a thing of the past, and Soviet-style socialism is now gone as well. Now, I'll just continue reading from this when we come back from the break. You're with Truth News Radio Australia, and I'm talking about the left-right divide and the kind of a trap that represents for thinkers and freedom-oriented souls. We'll be right back. Men and women of Earth, may I have your attention? This is Hereward Fenton, host of Truth News Radio Australia. You're invited to join the info war as we work to restore truth in media and challenge the dark forces which now dominate mainstream news. I'm calling on you, valued listener, to use your hard-earned dollars to help us smash the globalist empire. Visit truthnews.com.au and subscribe today. Back here with Truth News Radio, and I'm just reading to you an article here from Richard Ebling, July 2014, and just getting on to the section here where he talks about left liberal denials of freedom. What we are left with in American politics are those who call themselves liberals or progressives versus conservatives, and who claim to be ideologically very apart from each other. But are they really so far apart? On the left, the Liberals say they are for civil liberties and personal freedom, but they continue to advocate ever more government regulation of business, redistribution of wealth, and various forms of social engineering to manipulate human relationships and attitudes. They never explain how personal freedom can be maintained and civil liberties secured if the government imposes a thought police to enforce politically correct conduct and language, or if society is divided into racial, ethnic and gender groups, each to be assigned by political power certain affirmative favours and privileges at the expense of others. Nor can individual freedom be guaranteed when the government taxes away the wealth of some to redistribute to others deemed more deserving because of ideological influence or political clout. Likewise, liberty has very little meaning when government can seize people's property, regulate their business and industry, and interfere with the peaceful and voluntary exchanges that free men and women agree to for their mutual betterment. The left in America still does not get it. Freedom is an empty word if private property is not respected and if all human relationships are not based on personal consent. Now he turns to right conservative denials of freedom. On the right, in America, many conservatives still use the rhetoric of individual freedom and free enterprise. But beneath the surface, it is clear that too often this is mere form without content. And many mainstream conservatives have given up all interest and willingness to oppose and abolish the interventionist welfare state. They have made their own peace with big government. They believe that the wider American public cannot be weaned from political paternalism, so they have set themselves the more modest goal of getting control of the political machinery in order supposedly to manage the welfare state more cost efficiently and to use it to direct society in better and more virtuous directions. Some 50 years ago, conservatives used to tell their opponents on the left, "You can't legislate morality." Better conduct could only come, they would say, through improvements in the individual human hearts of men and women and through the peaceful possibilities of voluntary association. Rarely is this heard anymore on the conservative right. Instead, too many conservatives wish to use the government to socially engineer their fellow Americans in only a different form than their opponents on the left. Conservatives merely vie over control of school boards and educational curricula to see that public government school imposes a mindset on the youth of America different than the one the progressives would like to successfully implement. Now, I'll just leave it there. It's a good article and there's a lot more to it. This really goes to the heart of some of the things we've been talking about on the show recently. And, of course, last week I spent a long time talking about the controversy over the social engineering program Safe Schools Coalition and what that is doing to kind of undermine and erode individual freedom, individual choice. And, you know, it's a symptom of an attitude towards government which is still there on the right as much as it is on the left, even though at the moment we see the right complaining about this particular topic. You know, there are other programs that they would probably support which do the same type of thing but aiming in a different direction. Now, the most famous critique of all this from the 20th century derives from a man by the name of Ludwig von Hayek. And, of course, his famous book, The Road to Serfdom, is an expose of, among other things, the way in which both socialism and fascism are actually interconnected, and the central failing principle being this concept that we can control society through a centralised power structure. And Hayek's views are really, really very advanced. They're even still a little ahead, I believe, of the times. What Hayek really understood was the power of true democracy. And by that I mean in a pluralist society with millions of individuals, you have a vast reservoir of knowledge and opinion and expertise, and that true progress actually only comes when we are able to harness that. And that cannot happen when society is weighed down by this idea that everything will be made by some sort of central planning authority, that every decision will be made through some sort of central planning authority, and that society will be engineered to move in a particular direction, because that is actually imposing a ridiculous limitation, and it is denying us the benefit of the vast wealth we have in the millions of people on this planet. And in order to harness that, we have to reduce central planning. We have to reduce centralised coercion. Now, I'm actually going to play to you a video clip of a recording done, just a short clip, with Hayek from the 1970s, where he illustrates this one very important point. Here we go.
Could I just interrupt at that point? You say socialism is impossible in a technical sense. Now, what exactly do you mean by that?
It proposes a solution which is not a solution. You cannot. Well, it takes a long time, but it's my central problem. Socialism assumes that all the available knowledge can be used by a single central authority. It overlooks that the modern society, which I now prefer to call the extended order, which exceeds the perception of any individual mind, is based on the utilization of widely dispersed knowledge. And once you are aware that we can achieve that great utilization of available resources only because we utilize the knowledge of millions of men, it becomes clear that the assumption of socialism that a central authority can command all this knowledge is just not correct.
So what you're doing is you're turning on its head the common point one often hears from the left, that because the problems of modern society are so difficult, that they require planning. You're saying because they're so complex, they make planning impossible.
Well, I think the nicest form to put it is to say that socialism, protesting against the production for profit and not for use, objects to what makes the extended society possible. Production for use is only possible in a society where we know all the facts. But to achieve the situation where we are all working for people whom we do not know and are being supported by the work of people we do not know is made possible because we produce for profit. Profit is a signal which tells us what we must do in order to serve people whom we do not know.
Yes. Now, Johan von Mises put forward this criticism in the 20s. What reaction did you get from the socialists of the day?
Now, we're just about to go to break. I'll continue that when we come back. A very important point to understand here is this connection between the freedom to allow good solutions to be thought of from within society and the profit motive itself. We'll be right back.
If you can't beat 'em, eat 'em. That's the rallying cry of a new food movement, and their members could be living and hunting right in your neighborhood. I'm Dr. Catherine Albrecht, and I'll be back with more in just a moment.
Privacy is under attack. When you give up data about yourself, you'll never get it back again. And once your privacy is gone, you'll find your freedoms will start to vanish too. So protect your rights, say no to surveillance, and keep your information to yourself. Privacy, it's worth hanging on to. This public service announcement is brought to you by StartPage.com, the private search engine alternative to Google, Yahoo, and Bing. Start over with StartPage.
All you need is an open mind and a healthy appetite to help save the planet. That's the philosophy of environmental activists called invasivores. Their goal is to save the planet from invasive plants and animals by hunting them down and eating them. Governments have spent billions trying to eradicate pests like Asian carp and edible weeds that threaten native ecosystems, but they haven't had much success. Invasivores figure if they can get humans to develop a taste for dishes like broiled lionfish with sautéed field mustard greens, the invaders won't stand a chance. So they're blogging and writing cookbooks in hopes you'll help make mincemeat out of control species. I'm Dr. Catherine Albrecht. More news and information at CatherineAlbrecht.com.
Hi, welcome back. You're with Truth News Radio. And I'm just playing here a clip of Friedrich von Hayek talking about the central problem with central planning, which is a key feature of socialism, but which is a key feature of all modern Western systems, or all modern governments have become addicted to this excess of social planning and social engineering. And a very important point that he was making there just before the end of the break there was that the profit motive is part of the way in which we are able to harness the power of vastly disparate individuals. And it allows a degree of freedom, a large degree of freedom, for people to engage in whatever they choose to, and to be driven by the profit motive. But let me just continue here from the video, which I think it probably explains it better than I can. So just returning you to that video now.
You and von Mises put forward this criticism in the 20s. What reaction did you get from the socialists of the day? What reply did they make to that fundamental criticism?
They were unwilling to admit the factual argument. They preferred to withdraw on the fact that is a difference of values on which science cannot decide. Once you accept the socialist values that we must be guided by a conception of just distribution, all the factual arguments are irrelevant. Well, of course, the factual arguments prove that the just distribution is impossible unless the distributor knows all the facts. So my answer is, if the factual assumptions of socialism were correct, it would be a moral duty to aim at the just distribution. But you have to recognize you cannot do it. In fact, you can produce enough to maintain the present population of the world only because of a spontaneous process or mechanism which enables you to make use of infinitely more information than any central authority possesses.
Okay, now let me try and apply this to some of the more contemporary problems we've got, because a lot of what is going on now, it is partly what von Hayek was talking about there, but a lot of this decision-making and planning has now gone into the social engineering of society, or has gone into more and more obscure decisions that are made about how collective action needs to be taken. I say obscure in that they're harder and harder to prove. They're based on a belief that by taking these steps, by instituting programs, by in some cases raising taxes, that we will be able to steer society into this perfect direction. But as von Hayek says, in order to do that, you need a godlike level of knowledge, which no individuals have, no government has. We're becoming impoverished. We're losing the value and the wealth of knowledge and skills and thought, which is contained within this vast thing called humanity, by shrinking our horizon down to policies and objectives that can be contained within statute legislation designed to achieve a specific goal. And that's why in my introduction there, when I was talking about some of the distinctions between left and right, I actually talked about statute law as being one of the key features of a lot of left-wing thought, is that we've got to bring in a law for this, a law for that, a law to protect this group of people, a law to protect that group of people. And the legal system becomes weighed down by all this excessive legislation as well, creating vast bureaucracies and then confusion as to how that law should be applied, or even misuse and vexatious misuse of some of these laws, which can lead to persecution of harmless individuals. We live in a time where all of this has now sort of become more concentrated, and it becomes the central focus of government policy. Now, of course, it may seem that what I'm presenting to you here is I'm basically presenting to you myself as a right-wing individual, because a lot of what I'm saying does sound like I'm actually adopting the right-wing arm of this argument. However, let me counter that by saying that I don't dispute that government is useful, and I don't dispute that government has a role in regulating our society, as long as government hasn't exceeded its bounds and does actually represent the people, government simply becomes the focus, the lens, the funnel through which the people's will is directed. And of course, we have to have some mechanism of doing that. And that's what I see the mechanism of government as being. And although I do affirm the views of Hayek about the profit motive and free enterprise, I do believe that there's a lot of aspects in society where collective ownership is the only sensible position to take. I mean, and it's well recognised and understood that the air is collectively owned. But we don't even talk about it as being owned. We just allow for the fact that we all breathe air, including animals, including birds, including plants. No one wants to come along and say, well, we own the atmosphere. Similarly, I believe that the resources, like water resources and electricity and some basic infrastructure needs to be seen, and these are actually artificial creations in some cases, like dams and waterways and electrical power grids. These are best seen as not owned by private individuals or corporations. And most of us can see the value in that. And so by advocating that, I may be lumped in with a socialist viewpoint. And so people may accuse me of being a socialist. I'm in favour of some viewpoints which are regarded as socialist positions. I'm in favour of choice when it comes to abortion, but I do believe that abortion done beyond a certain date does become homicide, which does approximate to murder the older that embryo is. But I actually believe, and this is based on a lot of my own thinking and common sense, is that when a fetus is very, very small, that is virtually indistinguishable from, say, a sperm cell or an egg cell, and that we can't control people down to that extent of applying strict punitive laws about their management of their sperm and egg cells. And therefore also I believe that we can't enforce that level of restrictive control over people, over women who become pregnant in the first 8 weeks of pregnancy. And I know this is a controversial topic. There are various other topics in which I cross the line between left and right. I mean, I'm critical of the right-wing position about ownership of guns, not because I think that gun ownership should be strictly regulated and harsh laws such as we have in Australia are good. I'm against those harsh laws, right? But I feel that a lot of the right-wing position on gun ownership is actually based on attitude towards humanity, which I do not share. We'll get back into it when we get back from the break. You're with Truth News Radio Australia. Stay with us. I'm getting into some tricky subjects which require me to think very carefully about what I say.
In terms of creating wars is a mind manipulation technique called problem reaction solution. And it works like this. First of all, you create the problem, but you get someone else to be blamed for it. You then report that problem through the media in the way you want it reported. You get the public to react to your problem by saying something must be done, this can't go on, what are they going to do about it?
Hi, welcome back. And just continuing there from the break, I just wanted to point out that my view about gun ownership is that, first of all, I think it should be far less regulated than it is, certainly in Australia. However, I believe there are a couple of fallacies that people believe in regard to gun ownership. One of the main ones being that it is believed that allowing citizens to have access to automatic weapons will be an effective bulwark against tyranny. The problem there being that governments, because of where we've gone with technology, because of the wealth that governments now have, the amount of firepower that governments can muster in response to any kind of citizen militia is always going to be 100 to 1. It's going to be, unless we start legalising mortars and artillery and perhaps nuclear weapons for personal use, which I think most people don't agree with. But see, I think if you're going to be sensible and take that argument that the citizens need to have access to all kinds of firepower to protect the citizenship against tyranny, well then, yes, heavy arms, depleted uranium weapons and indeed nuclear weapons should be something that you could legally buy as a citizen, because that's what it's going to require ultimately if you go up against a major militarised government force. But look, I don't want to go on too much about that. I just want to play to you now a quick clip from Edward Griffin. And again, I'm not peddling the thoughts of Edward Griffin here. I don't agree with a lot of what Edward Griffin has said in some other topics, but I do actually like this particular interview, and we'll only be able to play a bit of it, but it's from an interview that he did on Infowars.com, which explains his take on the left-right paradigm. Here we go.
The growth of the Tea Party movement and the left-right paradigm, they're all sort of intertwined, and yet there are very separate intellectual threads that need to be followed in all of that. I think, first of all, it's important to talk about and understand this left-right paradigm. What is this all about? Most of us, including myself for certain, in my younger years, I was brought up thinking that you had to choose, if you were smart at least, you would have to choose politically between being on the right or the left. You had to have a political view. And I thought that in those days, I thought that the extreme right would be something like fascism or Nazism. And on the extreme left, of course, you would have communism or socialism, just a little bit short of that. So that was the paradigm that I was taught, and it seemed to make sense at the time. But as I became more involved in these issues and learned more about them, I began to realize that the basic philosophy between the so-called extreme left people, on communists and socialists, and the so-called philosophy on the right of the fascists and the Nazis was really the same. How can this be? They're supposed to be opposites of each other. And then I began to realize that there is something more common to all of these philosophies that was left out of my training and education. And that was the ideology of collectivism. I began to realize that the thing that was common to them all is something called collectivism. And that's a word that is not very well used. It's not very entrenched in the vocabulary of most people today. But I found out that it was a very commonly used word about a century ago. People wrote a lot about collectivism, and the opposite of that would be individualism. Those are two words that are sort of abandoned today, but in my view, I think they need to be recaptured and understood and used more. And I realized that communism and fascism, the so-called opposites, are merely variants of collectivism. They're the same thing. And they believe that the group is more important than the individual, for example, and the individual must be sacrificed, if necessary, for the greater good of the greater number. They believe that the state should be all-powerful and that the people should obey the state for the greater good of the greater number and all of that sort of thing. They believe that rights are granted by the state. They're not part of the human being. They're not God-given. They're not entrenched in his body and soul. They have to be granted by the state. All of these things, and you look at them one by one, communists and fascists and Nazis and socialists, they all believe that. So wherein lies the conflict, you see? And I began to question that. And I realized that it's partly a trick. In fact, I think it's a huge trick. It's a great scam, because people even today are thinking that they have to choose between the right or the left, not realizing that no matter which way they go, they've accepted basically the same ideology underneath.
And that's it. That's it, I believe, beautifully stated, and I agree with that 100%. It is a trick, it is a scam, and it is a trap, indeed. And it is a trap that we are encouraged to fall into, and I believe it is a trap that many intellectual people also fall into. And I want to actually play to you a clip here from Noam Chomsky, who, again, is a man who I don't uncritically support, but I do respect a lot of what he has said. A lot of his analysis is spot on. But then there are some places where it seems to me that Noam Chomsky loses all his critical perspective. And in this interview, which was done with host Abby Martin, and it's an interview that was done, I believe, on RT with Abby Martin. Actually, it may be more recent than that, but anyway, it's on YouTube right now. And in this particular interview, Chomsky appears to be lumping all political parties and the entire spectrum of what we see in America now with the right. And an interesting thing about Chomsky is that you'll never hear him use terms like collectivism or central planning, because this was the rhetoric of the so-called right-wing philosophers like von Hayek. And you never see him really address the critique of collectivism. You never see him really bring this up. And so when he talks about the right, he seems to be talking generally about excessive power, excessive control, loss of rights, loss of freedoms, and excessive foreign interventions. But he never talks about the extremes of the left that are done in the name of the greater benefit for the greater good. He simply just doesn't mention it. And so when he talks about the malaise affecting modern American politics, he describes it as everything having slid to the right. And I'll just play that for you right now.
As extreme as the political spectrum is right now in the U.S., there's still almost complete uniformity on the war on terror, the stance toward Latin America, sanctions on Iran, and there's really no anti-war candidate, despite popular opinion agreeing on that. Why can no candidate touch that?
The spectrum is broad, but in an odd sense. The spectrum is basically from center to extreme right, way off the spectrum. So the Republican Party about 20 years ago basically abandoned any pretense of being a normal political party. In fact, distinguished, respected conservative commentators from the American Enterprise Institute, right-wing think tank, like Norman Ornstein, described the Republican Party as a radical insurgency, which has abandoned parliamentary politics. They just don't want anything to happen. Their only policies are don't do anything or bomb. That's not a political party. It's what happened is that the party, during the whole neoliberal period, both parties shifted to the right, as everywhere in the world, and the Republicans just went off the spectrum. They became so dedicated to the interests of the extreme wealthy and powerful that they couldn't get votes. So they had to turn to other constituencies, which are there, but were never politically mobilized. Christian evangelicals, nativists who are afraid they're taking our country away from us, people who are so terrified that they have to carry a gun into a coffee shop, and that's their base, essentially. And when you look at and just take a look at the primaries, I mean, any candidate who has a semblance of rationality is not even competing. So that's the Republicans. I
just have to leave it there. Important point to note is that in Abby Martin's question to Noam Chomsky, she frames the entire question only in terms of foreign policy. She only talks about foreign policy. And when Noam Chomsky critiques American foreign policy, he's generally spot on. And when he says, and so when he talks about aggressive foreign policy and American domination and empire as being a right-wing phenomenon, he's correct. It is a right-wing phenomenon, and it's also equally evident on the faux left. And he points that out quite correctly. So the Democrats and the Republicans have been equally guilty of warmongering and doing terrible things in other countries. But then he characterises that as the entire spectrum of politics in the US having shifted to the right. There's no mention of so many other issues of policy within society that have been the subject of critique, even from the left. Even the Universal Health Care Act in the United States has been attacked from the left because it is essentially a corporatist imposition on people's freedom, forcing people to buy health care and then handing that over to the enormously corrupt pharmaceutical industry. I mean, he never criticises the pharmaceutical industry. He never criticises aspects of society which are loosely defined as socialist implementations. Okay, that's our show for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I tried to give you a balanced perspective, and I hope you understand more about where I'm coming from on this show. Next week, I have a really important interview coming up with Kevin Miller about the psychiatry industry and SSRI drugs. We'll be back next week. See you then. To today's show, I've got a very special interview lined up for you. Filmmaker Kevin P. Miller is coming back on Truth News Radio. He's been on the show a couple of times before, and we've been in previous shows talking about his earlier films, mainly his work in relation to psychiatric medication and SSRI drugs, which was covered in the film Generation RX. And that was a really important film, and I introduced a lot of people to Kevin Miller in Sydney as a result of that, and we actually did some screenings of the film in Sydney. And it was a really, really important contribution to the field because there aren't a lot of quality films that just come at it from a really impartial angle, a really good documentary filmmaking style. And Kevin is deeply involved in this, and as a result of the work he did on the first film, many of the people who he contacted got back to him later with more information. There were many letters that he received. And as a result of all that, over the next couple of years, he began to formulate an idea for a second film, which ended up becoming Letters from Generation RX, which extends the material that's covered in the first film. In my opinion, actually goes deeper. I found it more powerful in a lot of ways because it really goes deep into these personal stories. And these stories are really, really harrowing. They are absolutely bone-chilling tales that will... When you watch the film, when you understand the scope of what has happened to these families, you will realise that what people are telling you, like people like Dr. Peter Breggin, when they say that these drugs are incredibly dangerous, that they need to be regarded as a very, very, very dangerous chemical concoction, you will realise that this is not an exaggeration. This is actually just a simple factual matter. But the problem is, of course, that the PR campaign, the marketing campaign, the propaganda campaign behind the promotion of these drugs over the past 2 decades or more has been to steer the general public away from that realisation. But despite that, the information has leaked through. And this is what we're going to be talking about in a lot of depth today. And I've got a lot of questions and a lot of threads I want to follow in today's discussion. But that's enough from me. Welcome to the show, Kevin P. Miller.
Oh, it's so good to be back with you again. You have such a great show. I'm thrilled to talk about this with you and more over the next hour.
Absolutely, Kevin. Now, one thing I want to get into today's show, and I might just start with this because I think it's very important. I mean, your film is there for all to see, and I want people to find it and get it and download it, and we'll provide them all the information for that. One thing I want to talk about is the problem that we have, that ordinary members of the public have, who are not medical experts. We are not qualified to be judges of the efficacy of any kind of medical drug because we don't supposedly have the expertise. And when those of us who begun to wake up to the issues start to talk about this and try to share our knowledge with friends and often people who are on medications, we're often told in no uncertain terms to basically shut up because we basically are treated as non-experts and therefore not qualified to have an opinion. Now, of course, you're not a medical expert either, but you've done so much research that right. that people would be a bit hesitant, I think, to question you. But, you know, it's a real problem. And I just wonder, like, because you've spoken to so many people now, you must have encountered this. And what can you say to us? How can we express ourselves? How can we work to convince other people or to extend our knowledge when there is this kind of wall of prejudice that is basically created by this, this attitude within society that's created that you basically, do what the doctor says, and if you criticise or question medical procedures, well, you need to be an expert. Now, could you just briefly give me your response to that?
Sure. I mean, it's certainly a real problem in Australia.
Yeah.
It's a dire problem. And it's kind of funny in a way because one would think that Australia would follow at least the lead of the United Kingdom, who has been which has been very outspoken, particularly as these drugs pertain to children and teenagers.
Yes.
And we're talking about the antidepressants now. And, since, as we say in the film, 2004, the UK government came out and said that they were not only putting warning, they did everything but ban the drugs for children and teens, with one exception used, quote, more carefully, supposedly, end quote,
yes,
was Prozac because of the half-life of the chemical and all of this stuff. But, when you start talking about these issues, and you're right, I've encountered it quite literally hundreds, if not thousands of times at this juncture in my study of this.
Yeah.
I think that I always talk about integrity of the information. It's one of the reasons I love coming on with you, is because you're one of the few who I think identify the need for having verifiable information. And so when someone goes out and there's a school shooting and they go on Twitter or Facebook or any of the other social media sites or elsewhere, and they immediately draw a link and say, well, this person was on an antipsychotic or an antidepressant, and that's the reason for this school shooting. It's really not appropriate, and it's not something that I've adopted. I've run away from, as a matter of fact. So I think the first thing for your audience, first and foremost, is to be careful what you share. And like anything else, make certain that you have diversified sources for all of your news, health, medical, and otherwise. And one of the things that I've done to this degree in preparing for the release of the film is that I've started a Facebook page, and it's facebook.com/letters from Generation RX. And we've got about 7,000 people there to date, and it's been going up exponentially. And I really used that page I programmed that page with the news and information, studies and insights that people aren't able to gather from on their own. And even with the premise that, well, if we go to this site put together by Kevin P. Miller, that we're at least expecting that there's going to be a modicum of integrity here in terms of the information. It doesn't mean that everything that I put on that site is proven or a proven connection between X, Y, and Z, but it does mean that there is some commentary in there, some scientific studies, et cetera, that are helpful at unlocking some of the questions that so many people who have been on these drugs, have children on these drugs, or are what we're now calling psychiatric survivors, that they can utilize as a means to gather that fully informed choice before they make a decision. And I also try to do something that I think is kind of unusual. Even though a lot of the people that gather on the site are psychiatric survivors and others, there are a lot of people who are just questioning, as you are, how can I get better information? And so when those people come, and they do by the hundreds, and they say, someone said today, I've been on, I think he said Effexor for 14 years, and I've had no problems, and it's helped me. My response is not to attack those people in any way, shape, or form. I always lead with, I'm glad you're well.
Yeah.
And, we're here to serve people because I have spent the past 20 years or so investigating the science, investigating the research, and, of course, most importantly to me, talking to multiple hundreds of families and individuals that have gone through this. So I think, in part, when you write your elected officials or when you're even speaking to a doctor, if you have an article that's printed out from the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, or some other, an even credible news story in an outlet, you can print that out or put it on your phone and bring it into your doctor and say, look, I'm concerned about this. There's all kinds of reports about side effects from this drug. And even though I haven't, had violent thoughts or something while on an antidepressant, there may be something else that I'm reporting on the site. For example, now there's newer links that are being proven with prolonged use of SSRIs and even SNRIs, the antidepressants, to Alzheimer's and to memory loss. And so these are the kinds of things that I try to put out there for people and create an environment for people who are willing to at least investigate some of the other things contrary to possibly what's in their local newspaper or on their local television station.
Yeah, and the Facebook page, I've been following it. It really is terrific. There's been just a constant stream of really interesting articles on it. So, highly recommend that Facebook page. And the point there you made about a lot of people are happy on SSRIs, or they say they're happy. And this is very important to understand, because unless we incorporate that knowledge into our view, we're going to be biased, and we're probably going to come across as being a little bit extremist if we just try to take a very, very hardline position. However, I think it's a complex situation, isn't it? Because I've seen a lot of the analysis of this, which comes from the alternative perspectives of people like Dr. Peter Breggin, who say that you can't always be sure when someone says that they're okay, that they are okay. Because of the peculiar nature of the brain and some of the particular types of damage that is done to the brain by psychiatric medications and other treatments, has a habit of actually damaging those very parts of the brain that are needed to actually know whether you are okay or not. And this is a very tricky subject to deal with, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But I would say one thing to you is that, again, when people come to me in person or after a film screening, or again online on the Facebook page or what have you, I'm very careful to not demonize their choices. And I think, when we talk about stigma, and I have an interesting take on stigma in the film, as you might recall, I claim that the drug companies and the regulatory agencies are actually stigmatizing the people that have taken the drugs out of good faith by the tens and hundreds of thousands, but have been harmed.
Yeah.
And then when the drug companies are fighting so vociferously against these lawsuits that pop up by the hundreds and thousands, then they're basically telling the people, no, it's not the drug. It's your depression that's the problem. And this is the reverse of that stigma, isn't it?
Indeed. We're just going to break. You're with Truth News Radio Australia, and we'll be right back talking to Kevin P. Miller about his new film. Stay with us. Men and women of Earth, may I have your attention? This is Hereward Fenton, host of Truth News Radio Australia. You're invited to join the info war as we work to restore truth in media and challenge the dark forces which now dominate mainstream news. I'm calling on you, valued listener, to use your hard-earned dollars to help us smash the globalist empire. Visit truthnews.com.au and subscribe today. Back here with Truth News Radio, and I'm talking today to Kevin P. Miller about his new film Letters from Generation RX. Yes, Kevin, just before the break there, you were mentioning this phenomenon that we have that where adverse reactions from drugs are often attributed to the depression or the mental illness itself, which can lead people to commit suicide and other things. And this, of course, is a very easy out for apologists for the medication and for the whole industry of the way people are treated with psychiatric drugs. I just wanted to make another point, which is that it's kind of related to what I was saying at the beginning. When we try to communicate about this, to communicate our knowledge as non-experts, but people who've got a lot of life experience, and I've got a lot of life experience. I've known a lot of depressed people. I feel like I've experienced depression too. But here's another type of argument that's thrust at you when you try to bring this type of perspective, is people tell you, oh, no, you don't know about real depression. You've never been really depressed. And what a lot of people believe, and I believe this is a type of an argument or a type of a viewpoint, a propaganda viewpoint, which has been put forth by the medical industry and the pharmaceutical industry, is that there is this very strict divide between what they call real depression, which is clinical depression, which is a chemical imbalance, and you're just not feeling too good, you're feeling down, you're feeling upset for whatever reason. And this belief is very, very deep, especially in the people who are on meds, is that because they say, I've got an illness, right? And therefore, because they've got an illness and because they have been told that their illness is a biochemical imbalance, it is a completely self-sustaining belief system, if you know what I mean. It is very difficult to get in there. Yeah.
Well, I think that the real truth is, and you saw it in the film, there's a reason that I put the director of the National Institutes of Mental Health, Dr. Thomas Insel, near the beginning of the film, because I somehow got an interview with him, to his credit, because I fully believe that he knew who I was. It wouldn't have been too hard to discern.
Yes.
But he says at the very beginning of the film that, that the industry, let's call it, the broad description of the mental health industry, that's pharmaceuticals, psychiatrists, even social workers, psychologists, others, have been really patting themselves on the back, that they've achieved these great breakthroughs and that they've changed lives. And while Dr. Insel does say that indeed some lives have been saved by these drugs, and I believe that to be true in an emergency situation, I believe that a lot of drugs and other things can be very effective for the emergency.
Yeah.
Get you off the ledge, for example, just for one instance. So, but he does say in there that while we're patting ourselves on the back, that the science proves that these drugs are in no way a cure, and nor have they been scientifically proven to work or even to have benefit.
Yes.
So again, this is where this old position that you've heard from me in the past, where I've been fighting for 25 years for what I term medical freedom of choice.
Yes.
A lot of people, perhaps the more extreme elements that we've talked about in the past, and everyone knows who they are, they will tell you, no, we want these drugs banned. People should not have access. They are killing or hurting or maiming people, and they should just be pulled off the market. Well, look, I'm not in that position and never have been. My job is, especially as a filmmaker, is to make certain that you have all of the information that could humanly be collected from every perspective humanly possible. And then if you watch the film or read the transcript from the film or anything along those lines and still decide for yourself that this is the path that you need to go forward, or it's the best path for you, or that you're happy with the drug, then so be it.
Yes, I totally agree with you, Kevin, and I think it's really important to understand to at least understand the libertarian perspective on this, because this what I basically see it is. It's a libertarian perspective, because I believe that people should have the right to use whatever helps them. And one of the great people who spoke out about this was Thomas Zatz, who died recently. And he's got some great material on YouTube where he talks about this problem that we have in society, where basically all medications, not just psychiatric medications, but just about everything that is potent, that works, is illegal without a prescription. And then this creates a situation where you have to put 100% trust in a doctor's decision. And of course, doctors are influenced by marketing just like everyone else. And so you have...
Well, and one more important thing. I'm sorry to cut you off, but one more important aspect of this, since you're dealing with patient care, is that, as I've said in past interviews in England and elsewhere, is that no matter what system you're in now, even with a government funded system like in Canada or in UK elsewhere, is that the doctors still only have 5 minutes with you. And that's the huge shift. It's not like, I'm older than you, so when I grew up, we actually had a family doctor, a GP. Yeah. And this man was marvelous. And believe me, he was old school. So, he would use the drugs sparingly. And, of course, there wasn't as much of a problem with the proliferation of these prescription drugs as there is now for families to face. But he would have conversations with you, would find out what stresses you had, other things. And he wasn't afraid to even pull some old, some tried and true old remedies, even if they were homeopathic or what have you. So we've had this huge shift now. And yes, you're right. I mean, we're all taught now that we're supposed to genuflect before the white coat, as we do, a priest or someone else that we revere. And the fact of the matter is that I'm a person that defends doctors because of their lack of time with patients, but I do not defend their lack of intellectual curiosity, particularly if you have a situation now where, 5 years ago, I did an interview after Generation RX, and I was more defending doctors because they assumed that if there was a study in the BMJ saying that antidepressants were helpful, and particularly so for teenagers or young adults, that why wouldn't they believe it? They believed that it had been scientifically vetted. And of course, we are now learning in the last 5 to 6 years since the first film came out that it's, for the most part, and I mean the most part, I'm saying 95% or more, is nonsense. That it was commercially created science. Yeah.
So doctors are victims of this PR marketing campaign.
They are victims of it, but they're smart enough to read the newspaper. Yeah. And I follow the newspapers in Australia close enough to know that even though it's more rare, that these things are being reported and have been reported over the last 6, 8, 10 years. And we are at the point now where anyone that takes the oath of first do no harm should at least have pause about it. Yeah. And yet we're not finding that. I met a whole bunch of people when I was in Tampa, Florida, just over the weekend screening the film, and had a great audience. And I had a great number of people come up to me afterwards and say, I got started 2 years ago and then had all these problems, and then they weaned themselves off through withdrawals, really painful, horrific withdrawals that they were going through. And so there is no excuse for that at this point in the ball game. Even if you are a doctor and you put your heels firmly in the dirt and say, I believe in science, I believe in medicine, I believe in orthodox medicine, I believe in drugs, and you've got to take a pause and just do what's best to gather more information for your people.
Indeed. And we are just going to break. You're with Truth News Radio Australia. Really interesting discussion today. We'll be back for a couple more segments. Stay with us.
trouble breathing? You might want to reach for a bitter-tasting substance like grapefruit peel and take a big whiff. I'm Dr. Catherine Albrecht, and in a moment I'll tell you how bitter foods could be traditional inhalers for opening blocked air passages.
Privacy is under attack. When you give up data about yourself, you'll never get it back again. And once your privacy is gone, you'll find your freedoms will start to vanish too. So protect your rights, say no to surveillance, and keep your information to yourself. Privacy, it's worth hanging on to. This public service announcement is brought to you by StartPage.com, the private search engine alternative to Google, Yahoo, and Bing. Start over with StartPage.
Bitter foods may soon give pharmaceutical inhalers a run for their money. Researchers have found that inhaling bitter substances opens bronchial airways better than any known asthma medication on the market. Apparently, the bitter taste receptors we have on our tongues are also present in our lungs. If something tastes bitter in your mouth, the receptors in your lungs will pick up the bitter scent molecules too. The lungs react by opening up the airways. Scientists are experimenting with aerosols made of bitter substances like quinine, the ingredient that gives tonic water its bite. They believe this could help bring relief to millions of people suffering with bronchitis, emphysema, and asthma. I'm Dr. Catherine Albrecht. More news and information at CatherineAlbrecht.com.
Chemtrails.
Welcome back. You're with Truth News Radio, and my guest today is Kevin P. Miller, creator of Letters from Generation RX and Generation RX, two amazing films which explore issues with psychiatric medications, strong emphasis on people with depression taking SSRI drugs, but the latest film does get into a lot of other areas as well. Kevin, I just want to return to a point from we were discussing earlier where you said in your discussion with the NIH director, can you just repeat who that was in the film?
Yes, it's Dr. Thomas Insel, and that's spelled I-N-S-E-L. Yeah. He's the director, actually now he's the former director of the National Institutes of Mental Health. He has taken what I imagine is a pretty cushy job with Google.
I see.
As their health, whatever he's doing with them, but something regarding health, of course.
That's very interesting. And was he in his position at NIMH when he spoke to you, or was he already at Google? He was. Okay.
Yes, he was.
Okay, so that's interesting. Now, the point that he made, that these drugs do not cure depression, is very important because it gives the lie to what we're saying was basically a marketing campaign that these drugs fix a chemical imbalance. I mean, that's what everyone was told. That's what we were told for decades. And it wasn't just SSRIs, also the antipsychotics were said to do the same thing. And the ADHD drugs like Ritalin, we're constantly told there's a chemical imbalance and this is fixing the imbalance. But basically that is nothing more than a kind of a marketing strategy. Does that seem a reasonable thing to say?
Oh, it's poppycock.
Yeah.
I mean, that's been proven. That's been clearly, definitively proven that there is no such thing as a chemical imbalance in the brain as it's constituted. Now, I mean, as a person, I can say this a couple of different ways, but one of the things that I was going to mention earlier when we were talking about Australia is that on one hand, Australia has a very heavy hand in disciplining others regarding medicine or making claims, or they also come very heavily down on the, let's call it the nutrition industry, or vitamin supplements, mineral supplements, or herbs, etc. The very heavy hand, one of the toughest of any democracy in the world. And this is the other side of the coin. And for years they could tell us, oh, well, those vitamin people and those people that want you to take vitamins and minerals or amino acids or herbs, they're just flapping in the wind and there's no science behind them. And they postured as if they had all of the science behind them. Well, listen, that bird has flown out the door.
Yeah.
That has been revealed as false. And so we should no longer, I'll tell you what I'd encourage all of your audience to do respectfully to doctors that give them a hard time about this or anything else, is that there is no science. And you can have them mention Thomas Insel, or have them show their doctor the film or a portion of the film, because it's how can the orthodoxy posture as if they have all the answers and it's all science-based. The new catchphrase now is evidence-based research, but yet they don't. And they're telling everyone else that they don't have any science. And they're telling everyone else that vitamins and minerals, et cetera, are harmful. So this is where the double whammy comes in, because they not only convince people, as you said earlier, to listen to their doctor and, it's almost godlike. But then they're telling people, oh, it doesn't matter what you put in your mouth in terms of nutrition. It's not going to affect your brain. It's not going to affect your health or anything else. So, I mean, people need to be very skeptical about any kind of counseling or nutritional information that comes from a medical doctor, or even, dare I say, a licensed dietitian, because the dietitians are trained in the same way that doctors are. And this is where we get this ridiculous, well, in the United States, it's called RDA, Recommended Dietary Allowance. And, it's on the labeling on the side of a can of corn. It tells you how many carbs are in it and how much fat and how much salt and how much vitamin A is in there. So, I mean, we need to be very careful, because these are the very people that are telling us that all you have to do is eat right and all will be well with the world. Well, clearly that's false. And that's one of the things, as you know, that I explored in the new film, Letters from Generation RX, through the mouths and story of a family called the Stephan family of Alberta, Canada.
Really important part of your film, which I want to make sure we cover, because a lot of what's in the film is very depressing, and we're dealing with a subject that's depression, but basically the material that we've got to deal with is very harrowing, and you can feel very negative from it. But there is a positive angle to this, which you cover, and it's a significant part of the film, which is that new ways of dealing with mental illness have been developed along the lines of nutrition, and the particular word that you use in the film is micronutrients. And this is something that I think I would love you to actually expand on. We might as well get into that now because we don't have a lot of time. Micronutrients is a new treatment modality which developed out of Canada. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah. And there are a couple important points here I'll try to hit as quickly as possible. But we were just talking about the problem with the men in white coats and those in, quote, the orthodoxy. Well, we talk about how they talk about, vitamins and this, that, and the other. Well, in the film, we have a case of this family who they believed had cured their severe bipolar, OCD, depression, and two of their kids, including one child that was in a mental institution, in and out of a mental ward, another son who was very violent. And they just wanted a scientist somewhere to study these nutrients, these mix of mainly minerals, but also some vitamins and amino acids. And there's 36 ingredients in this product called it's called Empower Plus. And the literal hell that the establishment, Health Canada, Canada's FDA, put these people through, who were researchers at academic institutions. Yeah. And all they wanted to do was study the micronutrients and to see if it was even humanly possible. And by the way, their first approach, when the family approached them to study, they thought, well, you guys are completely off your rockers. You've lost your mind. There's no way that taking in minerals and vitamins could have anything to do with brain health. And so they were very skeptical. And finally, they agreed to take on a pilot study. Well, they got a $500,000 grant from the province of Alberta in Canada. And Canada's FDA, Health Canada, came in and illegally pulled the money from that study. So, on one hand, we have all these people screaming that there's no science to back nutrition claims, whether it's for vitamin A or for minerals. Yeah. And on the other hand, they won't even allow them to study to see scientifically whether or not there's any connection or any veracity to the belief that what you put in your mouth could affect your brain health. So, this is the part of the arrogance that comes from the healing arts, quote unquote, that we've been dealing with again for decades. And it's something that we really have to reverse as people. We have to protest and we have to turn the tables on them because it's critical. In the case of this family, we start the film with a harrowing ride on a Ford Bronco. And ultimately, this woman had a car full of her children and drove into a river while she was depressed. And so ultimately, she committed suicide. Her kids started feeling the effects a few years later. And this father is just like, I'm going to lose my two children here. And so he was just committed to just having someone study it. Yeah. And the resistance has been so terrific as we say in the film, the government of Canada spent $2 million pursuing this tiny nonprofit in rural southern Alberta near the Rocky Mountains. And they spent $2 million for if they had been...
We're just going to break. Sorry, Kevin. Sorry to interject.
$350 fine. Sorry.
We'll be right back for one more segment with Truth News Radio. Stay with us. Would you like to just continue from the thought there at the end of the last segment, talking about the family in Canada and their battle with the authorities?
Yes. Yeah. Indeed. It's the Stephan family. They started a company called True Hope, and they created a 36-ingredient vitamin supplement and mineral supplement with amino acids and a few other things.
Can I just interject? Can I just ask, yes. Do you know how they came up with that particular mix? What were they drawing on? Where did they get their ideas from for that particular mix of nutrients?
Well, there's a number of things. They had someone on board with the company for years, and it was just two minds coming together, if you will. But there was a conversation between them, and one of the things that was said was, evidently, when you're raising pigs, commercially, that there's a lot of aggression. They lock them into a pen, and they're really tight in there, so they start to get really aggressive, and they start getting violent. They'll bite another pig's ear off or a tail off or what have you. And so it came to light that there was strong research in the animal research side of things and the veterinary side of things, that if you just added minerals to their feed, that the aggression stopped. So it was this long, months-long conversation. And then they basically were experimenting. They were trying various mixes of how many minerals of this amount and how many vitamins of that. And they were trying things individually and ultimately used their kids as kind of the big guinea pig at the very beginning of it until they cured the two kids, and they are still well 20 some odd years later. And they were able to get these researchers that I was talking about to do some of this research. Now there are 30 studies worldwide about micronutrients and brain health. But, right before we went to the break, I was making a point of how the government of Canada pursued this family, and they are still pursuing them to this day through various other harassment, means of harassment. But they were pursuing, they spent $2 million on what, if the company had been convicted, would have been a $350 fine.
Incredible.
So they pick out these outliers, and they basically, it's what the orthodoxy has tried to do to nutrition people for 25 years that I've been following. They will attack. They will use the government as their weapon. And then they will try to bankrupt you. Because who can stand against the government and all the millions and tens of millions of dollars that the government can bring to bear? But this family said, "The heck with it. It saved our children, and we're going to fight." And they spent this tiny little company over the years $750,000 fighting the government to keep their product on the market.
And is it still available now? I mean, can we order it online now?
Yeah, it is. It's True Hope is the name of the company, and I obviously don't have any affiliation with them. I put them in the film because it was a fantastic story, and it illustrated really what I've been observing over the last 25 years. Anytime anyone would try to make a claim about any kind of nutritional supplement or anything being of value. I remember, we've talked in the past that I was involved in the early days when the FDA was fighting folic acid. And there was information in 1981 that was brought out by a doctor that said if you take 400 micrograms of folic acid, any woman of childbearing age, if she's taking 400 micrograms of folic acid, that it will prevent over 99% of birth defects, spina bifida. And yet the FDA delayed that for 18 years. And then their solution was, it wasn't to tell people to go take a 1 cent folic acid pill. Their solution was to fortify the food supply with synthetic folic acid.
Yes, Australia has an organisation called the Therapeutic Goods Administration. It's not quite the same as the FDA. They don't sort of approve drugs, but they are a regulatory body, and they will pronounce certain things as being not acceptable, and they can make certain things illegal. If they recommend a certain product as being dangerous, it will end up going into legislation. It will become illegal. The TGA in Australia has had various things banned, including alternative cancer treatments, and some of these alternative cancer treatments are just amazing and are saving people. There's thousands of testimonials over the internet about things like black salve, but if you try to sell it in Australia, you could go to prison. That's how strict they are. Now, with this, what's the Canadian mixture called? What's the product called?
It's called, the actual product is called Empower Plus.
Empower Plus.
The word EM Power with a plus sign on the end.
Right.
And I don't know that. I think their website's truehope.com. I'm not 100% sure because I haven't gone to it in forever. But they're still selling it, but they have to manufacture it now in the United States, even though they live in Canada.
Really? Well, that's very interesting.
And they allow us, I think, I'm not sure if it's exactly the same formula in Canada. They might have to do a little bit less in terms of the ingredient amounts and everything else. Because, again, Canada, just like Australia, Canada's been banning things since 1992. I mean, they took L-carnitine off the market. They took all kinds of things off the market 25 years ago that haven't seen the light of day since. So I think, we're back to the medical freedom of choice conversation. Yeah. And it's, it really doesn't matter. If they think we're delusional, fine. But they're obviously, in the United States of America, it's the largest, quote, test market for vitamin and dietary supplements in the world. More than half the population here takes dietary supplements on a daily basis. And you're talking about then, of course, 165, 170 million people minimum. And a lot of people believe it's more than 200 million people in this country that do so. Yeah. So where are all the deaths? Where's the harm? Yeah. Where's the poisoning? Where are the hospitalizations? They're not there. And yet this system still is in existence. Well, I think we talked about years ago, there was a 2009 study from the American Poison Control Centers, and there were zero, I'm sorry, my headphone falls out. There were zero deaths from vitamins in 2009. Zero.
Yeah.
And yet this kind of arrogance from the medical orthodoxy is allowed to continue to exist and thrive.
Obviously, because these products can't be patented and therefore they can't be commoditized effectively. They could still sell them. The pharmaceutical industry does sell vitamins, but they don't make so much money. They don't make anything like the money they make out of their patented drugs. So if the pharmaceutical industry were to follow that research, sure, they could continue, but they wouldn't be no longer so powerful as they are. And of course, the power is what they're trying to protect, isn't it? It's the power in terms of all the money that they make, and that is dependent on our belief that we need these, synthesized, unique drugs that only they create with their godlike powers.
It's true.
Yeah.
But, I mean, healthcare everywhere is a mess. And I'll never forget, I think I told you the story. I'm sure we're running out of time. But there were 33 Chinese bankers that I spoke to about 10 years ago. And they were coming here to try to get glean how small business people do business in America and the rest. And I looked them right in the eye. I was the most unconventional speaker of all these people, of course. And I said, look, if you want your economy to thrive, start investing in your own regional traditional Chinese medicines. If you want to bring your economy down, import Western medicine and give it to your 1.7 billion people. And your economy and the rest of the world economy will go down with you if you do that.
Yeah. So. Absolutely.
And by the way, the response was very positive to me.
and just another point about vitamins. Vitamin C, the humble vitamin C, is now being recognised as being incredibly important in gum disease. I mean, this is something that dentists have not been telling us about for many years because the information has been there. But vitamin C is one of the most important things you can take to reduce gum disease. And it's a simple thing, but this information is actually now coming out through like peer-reviewed studies. So we are seeing a kind of a revolution in understanding health, which is just really basic. It's just about very, very simple things that we can do that somehow we've just been locked out of.
Well, you know how we're having this strange political movement here in the United States, of course, and he who I refuse to name on the Republican side, and then you've got Bernie Sanders, who's a very liberal Democratic senator who's been saying the same thing for 30 years. Well, now the young people are looking at Bernie Sanders in particular. I'm not saying he's going to win, but they're looking at him and saying, "Wow, that guy has integrity. He's been saying the same thing. He doesn't shift his positions." I think something there's a movement akin to that happening in medicine. The only problem is that healthcare is so dominant such a dominant part of Australia and the United States and everywhere else's gross national product. Quite literally, it's 25 cents minimum off of every dollar that's spent on a national economy. It goes to healthcare, and it's probably 2 times that. But there's this movement now that people are insisting. And I would love to see Australia come into the 21st century and pass something like a DSHEA movement, the Dietary Supplement Health Education Act, that we had here in the United States. It was passed in 1994. And it's the only reason we have access. And, there's so many things. You and I could go on and on and on for hours, and it would be a privilege to do so. And it's just so great to have the opportunity to talk about these things in a way with someone as intelligent and insightful as you and your audience. So thanks. I appreciate all of your time.
Thanks so much, Kevin. And, this discussion is really just an intro to some of the thoughts and ideas in your film. And we've barely touched on the film. I will continue to bring information to the listenership of this show, and we'll be talking to you again. Thanks, Kevin.
That sounds great. Thank you. Have a great day.
Great. That's Truth News Radio Australia signing off for this week. See you next week.